Hi, welcome. I'm Julia Bryan-Wilson, the Doris and Clarence Mallow Professor of Art History and the Director of the UC Berkeley Arts Research Center. And I'm here with Alfredo Jaar as part of a class I'm teaching with Professor Annika Linson called Comparative Conceptualisms, Latin America, Middle East, North Africa. And we are just absolutely delighted and honored to have Alfredo join us for this talk, which has been co-sponsored by the Latinx Research Center and the International Consortium for Critical Theory. We had really wanted to have Alfredo come visit us in person, of course, and be a part of our seminar, but because of the pandemic, we're doing this via Zoom. I should also mention that this would have been right around the time that Alfredo would have been opening a major retrospective in Sao Paulo that was to have been in 4 different venues simultaneously, and that has now been postponed until September of 2021, which we all are very eagerly looking forward to. I'm going to keep my introduction of Alfredo relatively short, in fact, very short, because of course we just want to hear from him. He has graciously agreed to do a special artist talk for us that really does focus on his earliest conceptual work happening during the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, and then some projects afterwards that directly engage with questions of public space and institutional critique. And I'm really, really grateful for him for doing this for us, and especially for molding it into the theme of this kind of conceptual framework. He is, of course, one of the most famous, renowned, influential, and lauded conceptual artists working today. He calls himself a political conceptual artist. He has won many, many awards, too many to mention, but you can find his bio in the, more information in the bio below. I'll just mention a few things, which is he has been the recipient of a MacArthur Award, a Guggenheim, and most recently in 2020, he was the recipient of the Hasselblad Prize for photography. So Alfredo, a huge welcome to you. I will turn things over to you in 1 second. I also want to mention that you can ask questions to the audience at any time in the chat function, and those will be collated. And after Alfredo finishes his talk, he and I will have a little bit of a conversation, and then we will be taking questions from the audience. We've left a generous amount of time for that engagement. And a very special warm welcome also to my students, both in my class on visual activism and in comparative conceptualisms. So without further ado, I'm handing things over to you, Alfredo.
Thank you, Julia. I'm really happy to be here at a distance with all of you. So I'm an artist, I'm an architect, I'm a filmmaker. I would have loved to be a musician, but for the moment, I dedicate myself to art. That's what I do. And I'm going to share with you some works that I did early on in my career, and then the most recent ones. So let's start. Let me share the screen. Here we go. I'm going to start with this image taken on September 11, 1973, around 11 in the morning. What you see there is President Allende, who has learned that there is a military coup going on, and he's coming out of La Moneda Palace, which is the presidential palace. It's the last image we have of him alive. As you know, the coup took place that day, courtesy of Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kissinger. Allende was a good man. Today, still in the streets of Santiago, you can find this graffiti with a quote from him. It says, "El ser joven y no ser revolucionario es una contradicción hasta biológica," which means to be young and not to be a revolutionary is a contradiction almost biological. This is what he said. So I'm going to show you first this work. I was 18 years old, and I was starting my studies of architecture, but I was also interested in graphic design. And then I had just discovered letra set. Letra set, these are plastic letters that you can use to write words or numbers on plans, on drawings, that we use a lot in architecture. And I wanted to commemorate the beginning of the military coup. So I wrote down 11 September 73, and I wanted to make it symmetrical because this is the way I think. And I thought I'm going to put the time of the first bomb. And so I put 12:10, the first bomb that fell on the La Moneda Palace. And I kept this. I didn't know I was going to be an artist. I was going to study architecture. That was my first year. I loved graphic design, so I was doing really a graphic piece. Much later, maybe 20 years later, I realized that I had done my first work of art. Another gesture I did quite early on, I'm still 18 years old, still the first year of architecture. I wanted to represent this nightmare that had fallen upon us after the coup. As you know, repression, violence, disappearance of people, etc., censorship. So again, playing with lettres settes, I decided to change the calendar of September 73. And the coup happened on a Tuesday, September 11, as you can see there. And with lettres settes, I decided to change the days after the 11th. And I changed them from 12 to 11, 13 to 11, and so on. So I wanted to suggest that that nightmare started on the 11th and was going on forever. And of course, we all wanted this nightmare to end. I stopped on Tuesday 18th that I transformed in 11 because I ran out of number 1 in the letter set. So that's why it stopped there. So after that, I showed it to my friends at school in architecture, and they loved it, and I decided to go further. And so I got an entire calendar. And again, using letter set, I wrote down the 1973 on the back of the cover because I hated the official cover of the calendar. And I'm going to move on through the month. And when we get to September, I transform every day into 11th. Here, I didn't use letter set. It would have been a nightmare to do that. I just copied the 11th with photocopy, like Xerox copies, and I cut them out very carefully, and I just glue them on the calendar, replacing every day into an 11. And it goes on to October, November, and December. Later, I had discovered that many, many years later, I discovered this drawing I had done in my own notebooks at school, where I suggested to do this calendar in a single page. And so the top drawing says, solo 11 después del 11, which means only 11 after 11th. And then at the bottom it says, un 11 para siempre, 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 which means an 11 forever, ever, ever. And my plan in this drawing was to make it black. So much later, I was able to realize it. Now with computers, of course, no letter set. And here is a detail of that calendar. Also, on my notebook, I discovered these pages where at school, without even realizing it, I was just obsessed with this number 11, 11, 11. So I discovered 3 of these pages, and we framed them and we showed them in a big exhibition quite a while ago. But again, I'm not aware that I'm becoming an artist. I'm not aware of what I'm doing, really. I was just expressing my rage, my frustration, my sadness to this event. Here, I got to half a page and I got tired, obviously, and I stopped. This is another work done also in 1974. Again, I'm still 18 years old. It's done with letter set. Here it's framed. This is the original. I had discovered that in 1973, so the year before, the year of the coup, Pablo Picasso had died, but also Pablo Neruda, who is a very important Chilean poet. And then also Pablo Casals died, who is Pablo had died. And dictatorship, from the beginning, they started killing dissidents and people that they accuse of being communist. And so obviously Pablo is a very common name in Chile, so I imagine that they had killed many, many Pablos. So at the bottom of this drawing, you see Pablo Picasso, the date he died, Neruda, the date he died, Casals, the date he died, and then Anonymous, the 1973. So this was a monument. This was a gesture to remember these Pablos and to celebrate their lives without knowing really who are these Pablos who died. At the time, I started making magic. I became a magician. I wanted to change the world, and I thought I would do it with magic. I didn't know that I was going to become an artist and actually try to change the world as an artist. But at that moment, I started making actually magic tricks. So this is a portrait of the time. This is one of my best known projects done in Santiago at the time. It's called Studies on Happiness. I was reading Henry Bergson, his writings on laughter. I felt laughter was very important during this repression, because if not, you would just kill yourself. And I came up with this idea in a moment where there was no democracy, no possibility of expressing yourself and giving your opinion about the military junta. So this is a project I did in 7 different phases. In the first one, I went out to the street and asked people if they were happy. So I have a panel behind me, and I ask them to vote, and I give them a mint. And I tell them, if you're afraid you cannot vote, just eat the mint. And if you would like to participate, please put the mint inside the little box. So I had 3 friends with me. One was photographing me, and there were 2 in each corners of the street to make sure that cops were not coming. And so I was quite afraid. You can see it in my face. And here I am moving to the next spot in the city. So the questions were: estimate a percentage of happy people in the world or in Chile. And then, are you happy? This is a moment where there is no democracy, there is no elections, you cannot speak freely, there is censorship. So I wanted to offer a poetic way for people to express themselves. I wanted to create a model of democracy in a moment where there was no democracy. Then I moved on to the next phase, which were portraits of happy and unhappy people. So here you have 3 of them. I had questions for them. I took sessions, photographic sessions with them. So we photographed them, and then I had a basic information data and a number. Then I moved into public presentations of happy and unhappy people. I had recorded interviews with them, and they accepted to display themselves on this stage built by myself with a schedule. So this day at this time, there will be a happy person on one side and an unhappy person on the other side, and inviting spectators to come and look at them. And what was interesting to me is that after a while, someone would dare to ask a question to one of the participants. And then they would start an incredible philosophical discussion about happiness. And of course, no one could say anything about the military junta, about the coup, about the repression, about the disappearances, about the death, because we were afraid. And of course, we thought there might have been spies all around us. But if you look at the faces, you can look at and see the fear. And then I decided to go further, and I decided to invade the streets with these questions all around the city. And then at the same time, I set up a little installation at the museum offering people the possibility to give me an answer. So there was a little stage with some questions and a monitor where we recorded the answers. It's me there trying out the system to make sure it works. As you can see, I was a hippie, so that was in my favor because cops, when they stopped me many times, they thought I was a crazy person and they wouldn't see me as a political being. So that played in my advantage. So we recorded hundreds of hours, and people was afraid. They would not say much. And this is a typical appearance by someone. This girl will not say a single word, but she wanted to present herself. So this lasts a few minutes, so I will stop it here, but it is this kind of appearances that I got. And also some friends of mine came. This is Raúl Zurita. He's a very well-known poet. He was part of a group called CADA.
Nacionalidad chilena. Cédula de identidad 622-777-6-9. Edad 30 años. Actividad escritor. 2. Entonces, aplastando la mejilla quemada contra los ásperos granos de este suelo pedregoso, como un buen sudamericano, alcé por un minuto más mi cara hacia el cielo, llorando, porque yo que creí en la felicidad, había vuelto a ver de nuevo las irredarguibles estrellas. Gracias.
So here, Raúl, of course, spoke about happiness in very poetic and very veiled ways, of course, because we're all afraid of the censorship and being disappeared. Here I have some screenshots of the kind of things that people would do without showing their faces. They have, for example, this person has a text about missing people, notes on a bill, etc., etc. Some people spoke. You could hear their voice, but you would never see them because they didn't want to be seen on the camera. But it was a space of freedom. And I believe that art today is still the same. It's still the last space of freedom that we have. And in this modest installation, I wanted to create a space of freedom in a moment where we didn't have any. This is another work. It's called Opus 1981. I was interested in looking at images, and my father subscribed to this French magazine, and I saw this extraordinary image taken by Susan Meiselas in Nicaragua, and I loved it. I saw this man playing clarinet in a war zone, and so inspired by this image, I decided to do a performance. And that performance was recorded on a Betamax, this prehistoric object. And it consisted of inhaling deeply into a clarinet and then exhaling deeply in a clarinet and repeat the process until I'm exhausted. And so I lasted 7 minutes and 15 seconds. It was called Opus 1981 Andante Desesperato performance. And so this work was in my archive, and a curator discovered this a few years ago. I had a retrospective, and they wanted to show it. So we are showing here the image of the tape, the image from Susan Meiselas, and the video. So here, of course, I could not say anything against the military junta, against the oppression, against the violence. So this was my way to express my rage with this sound, without words. And if you're curious about the hairstyle, I can assure you it was very fashionable at the time. So this is called Opus 1981. Another project done in Santiago before leaving, this is called Telecomunicación. And I had clipped this image from a newspaper, local newspaper, that shows these women in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, that they practice this old ritual of banging the streets with these garbage cans covers to communicate the news of the death of one of the members of the IRA that was in a hunger strike in the prison of Maze in Northern Ireland. I was fascinated by this photograph, and I decided to do a performance inspired by this image. So I got 6 covers of garbage cans, and I went out in the streets of Santiago and placed them in the landscape as a sign of death. Of course, because the cops didn't have the reference to which these images were based on, they didn't say anything. They asked me what the hell I was doing. I just said, I'm a photographer and I like these white shapes on the ground. So this is how I was able to get away with it. But the trick was that at the end of this photographic process and this performance of putting these shapes, white shapes, in different locations in Santiago as a sign of death, I exhibited them like this. So basically, you have the clipping being repeated 9 times, and then you have the images in the streets of Santiago. And then I decided to leave Chile because I was suffocated by the political repression. I couldn't breathe. But my father had told me that I would not leave before I got my degree in architecture. So I did. And the day after getting my degree, I went home, I showed it to my father, and I said, now I leave. So I wanted to do a gesture of farewell. And I came up with the idea of dividing Chile by half with 1,000 flags from the Cordillera, from the mountains to the sea. As you know, Chile is a very long and narrow country. And I did that because the discussions, the polarization between the two sides was extremely intense. One side wanted Pinochet to stay, and the other side wanted the return of democracy. And there was no dialogue between the two sides. And for me, it was as if the country was committing suicide. So I wanted to illustrate this with these flags in the desert and going into the sea. And they end up in the sea almost as if they are committing suicide. At the time, there were rumors that people were being buried in the sand and also thrown from helicopters into the water with weight in their feet. But there were only rumors. And later we learned that it was true. So then this work acquired a different dimension. At the time, I didn't know this. And I just wanted to divide the country in half. I moved to New York in '82. And the first thing I wanted to do was to look at images of September 11, 1973. Because in Santiago, during the dictatorship, we had everything censored, and all the media was controlled by the military government. So I managed to find in an old bookstore clippings, newspapers and magazines from September 1973. And I selected some images to do this work called caras, which means faces. Each one of these works consists of the clipping from the magazines or newspaper that were images from that week in Santiago. And I would just blow up a face without any words. I thought that I needed to show those faces, and I didn't need to do and to say anything else about the dictatorship. Just to show those close-up was enough, in silence. For example, this man here was shot by a French magazine in the National Stadium. This is where they brought in the dissidents, and most of them were killed. This man knew he was going to die. But it's very difficult for you to actually see that in the small photograph in a black and white newspaper or magazine. So when you blow up the face, then you actually see that. This was the start of many, many works that I called politics of images that I'm interested in, and that has defined what I do in many, many ways. So as you can see, when you look at that image in a magazine, you just glance at it, but don't see much. But then if you take those faces out and blow them up, then you will see more. So that was the objective of this project called Faces. For example, this little girl in this funeral, this is a funeral of Pablo Neruda. She's hidden there on the right side between three men. Whoever looked at that image in the magazine never saw her. And I thought I have to show that face, which is maybe the saddest face you'll ever see. Now, all this work were done in New York in early, when I arrived from 82 to 85. But of course, at the time, nobody cared about this work, so they were never seen, never shown, and they went into my storage. And of course, this man became my enemy number one, and I dedicated quite a few works to him. As you know, he's responsible for thousands, millions of deaths around the world, not only Chile or Argentina or Brazil, but also Indochina and Vietnam and so on. So this is what Kissinger said in June 1969. Latin America is not important. Nothing important can come from the South. History has never been produced in the South. The axis of history runs from Moscow via Bonn and Washington to Tokyo. Henry Kissinger, June 1969. So what I did in my notebook, I took a page out, I wrote this thing with a typewriter, and I just made a hole. And so the black you see is just the background of this black cardboard that I use as background. And I start sending postcards to my friends saying, buscando a Kissinger, which means looking for Kissinger. He was my target number one, I mean, as an artist. And then in one postcard, I dared to write arresten a Kissinger, which means arrest Kissinger. This is all 84 and 85. And at the time, Mr. Kissinger had written two books, two biographies, I mean, one biography in 2 volumes. And so I bought them and I read them, and he dedicated just a few lines to Chile. And so what I did, I took all the pictures from the 2 books and I displayed them in a vitrine. This is an eye view from above these vitrines. And this is a sequence of all the pages, the photographic pages found in the 2 biographies of Mr. Kissinger. And what I did with a red Sharpie, I put a circle around his head. So he's there around the world talking to leaders from around the world with politicians. And I was just following him and putting these red lines around his head. And the work's climax is that he never mentioned Chile in the books, and there are no photographs of him in Chile or anything like that. So what I did, I had found this extraordinary image about Kissinger handshaking Pinochet. And so I created a special vitrine for him, and I framed it, and I put it at the end of the sequence. So this is the image that he left out. And so this work is called Searching for Kissinger. And I will end my early work with this work. It's my first neon. It's from 1985, Cien años de soledad, no realmente. It means 100 years of solitude, not really. And it's based on the fact that when I moved to New York, I discovered that the most well-known, the most famous book about Latin America was this book by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a Colombian writer, called 100 Years of Solitude. It's a fantastic book. It's a beautiful book about magic realism and so on. But that book, in a sense, did a lot of damage to exoticize Latin America and to give a very symbolic, magic realist type of image. And I was totally against that. So I created this piece with the title of the book, and in parentheses in red, not really. And of course, it makes reference to the fact that we're not alone. We were always so-called protected by the United States with all these military interventions year after year and after year. So this is the first part of my presentation to you today in reference and in homage to Julia's class about Latin American conceptualists. And now I'm going to share with you quickly some 4 projects, 4 or 5. These are public interventions because I've always had a foot in the art world and a foot outside of the art world. Because our little art world is a small elite, and I've always felt the need to get out and create these works with a larger audience where I test different languages. So it keeps me alive, it keeps me creative. And I love to do them. So I've done some 75 public interventions around the world so far. This is Montreal in Canada. This is the center of the town. And as you move south, you will reach the cathedral, which marks the border between the old and the new Montreal. And the old Montreal is an area with a lot of boutiques, restaurants, a lot of tourists, a lot of pedestrian areas. I was invited to create a project in this building, which is called the Cupola. And so I went 7 times to Montreal during 1 year because I wanted to understand the essence of the place. The modus operandi that I've used is the modus operandi of the architect, meaning that for us architects, context is everything. So here, I needed to understand the context before acting. And so my manifesto became, I will not act in the world before acting in the world. So here, I'm trying to understand the essence of this place, of this context, of this community before acting. So, as I said, I went 7 times. This is inside the tower, which is empty. And it measures approximately 7 floors tall. It's very tall. And this is a photograph taken from the roof of a church, which is a yard 100 meters away. I want to see the outreach of these windows into the city. So I went 7 times and I could not understand the essence of the place, and I couldn't find the right idea, the right intervention. But one day I was walking back towards the cupola that you can see there, and I saw this van, and I saw a few men coming out of this van and carrying large boxes with food and fruit and vegetables. And so I became curious, so I approached the van because I didn't see any hotel or any institution there. And I saw this inscription on the van. It says, "Together it is possible to alleviate hunger." So I became even more curious. And so I approached the facade, I looked for the door. It was very discreet. And on top of the door, they had this sign that said, "Accueil Bono." So I rang the bell and I got inside and I discovered a homeless shelter. So extremely clean and very discreet facade with no sign whatsoever what's happening inside. So I spoke with the director of the Accueil Bonneau, and he told me that there were 2 more shelters in the area, and then I had never seen them. I had been there 7 times in the area, and I never saw them because they were so discreet. So one of them was here at the bottom of this church in the basement. And the third one was here, a large villa called La Maison du Père, the house of the father, where they welcome entire families. So I was shocked to discover that Montreal, which is one of the richest cities in the world, which has one of the worst winters in the world, had 15,000 homeless people. So I went back and I started visiting the shelters and speaking with the homeless people. And most of them told me the same thing. They said, we are invisible. We go out in the street, we ask for help, we ask for change, and nobody sees us. They look always to the other side, as if we don't exist. It's not a problem only, of course, to Canada or to Montreal. We do this everywhere we go. We ignore the homeless that is sitting somewhere on the streets. So I decided to try to give visibility to homelessness, since these institutions that are doing this magnificent job are doing it in such an invisible way. And the homeless felt invisible. So I came up with an idea, and I submitted that idea to a vote. And I asked the inhabitants of the 3 shelters to vote. And this would be realized only if they accepted, and if they liked the project and they voted yes. So the majority did, and this is what we did. We installed inside the cupola 100,000 watts of red lights. And then when these red lights were triggered, the cupola would go red for just a fraction of a second. And we installed a device inside the 3 shelters. Now I'm going to go inside the shelters, but I'm not going to show you a single human being. And we had a sign here, you can see it on the right side, with a photograph of the cupola and a text that explains to the homeless people using the shelters, if you like your presence to be known to the city, please push this button and the cupola will be illuminated in a red light for a fraction of a second. So we had this sign in the 3 shelters. And so the project was called Lights in the City. And the idea was to create a socially painful sign. We wanted to metaphorically reproduce a distress signal visible day and night in Montreal. And so it happened. People came at night for dinner, for dancing, for bars, etc., to meet with friends. The cupola had this very important presence at night, and then suddenly the light would go red to signal that another homeless person was entering another shelter. So we made the front pages of all the magazines and newspapers of Canada. And the other 14 shelters in the city wanted to join us, to be connected to this tower of shame. But 6 weeks later, the mayor of the city said enough is enough, and he stopped the project. So this is a way for me to give visibility to the homeless without infringing on the privacy and on dignity of the homeless people, without displaying their faces. So it's a portrait of homelessness without showing their faces. But also the red light on the cupola make a reference to the fire, because this cupola had burned 5 times in its history. It was always rebuilt and rebuilt. But this time it's not a physical fire that will destroy this tower, but the fact that Canadian society allows for 15,000 homeless to go homeless every night. Lights in the city. This is Helsinki in Finland. It's a beautiful city. But these days we have this kind of images, of course, before COVID, because there is a political party that is anti-immigrant and that is manifesting in the streets against immigrants. And so I was invited to do a project in Helsinki. This was a time when Finland was applying to become a member of the EU. And I was looking at these people all around the city. It's a very homogeneous society. And I was shocked at the fact that they were rejecting immigrants in such a way. And I thought there was a contradiction between wanting to become a member of the EU, the European community, and at the same time closing your doors to members of other communities. So I decided to do a project about this. And for that, I required legal help. And I invited Matti Worry, a human rights lawyer, to help me to get the permits, because I needed to get the permit from the immigration authorities of Finland to realize this project. And we managed after 6 months of fighting with them. And this is a project, it's called 1 million Finnish passports. And here they are displayed behind high security glass. Why 1 million? I had calculated that in most European countries, approximately 20% of their populations are foreigners or people of foreign descent. Because Finland had 5 million inhabitants at the time, if Finland had a normal immigration policy like the other countries of Europe, they should have had 1 million immigrants. So these are their passports. So I wanted to ask the Finnish population, do you want to remain insular, or do you want to welcome new faces, new ideas, new colors, new sounds? So it was a portrait of the 1 million missing Finnish citizens of Finland. The lighting of the physical barrier, the glass, security glass, was such that people would see themselves reflected and they would see the passport through their own image. The authorities of immigration in Finland asked me to destroy the passports after the exhibition, to burn them, and without photographing or filming the burning. I accepted because I really wanted to do this work. And so the work had an incredible success. It was reproduced everywhere, and it triggered a discussion about politics and about immigration in Finland, which was my objective. But the most moving, the most beautiful reaction was a Finnish citizen that came to see the work. He was moved to tears. He went back home in search of his own passport and came back in the afternoon and threw it on top of the pile as a sign of solidarity with these immigrants that never came. So after the exhibition, as I said, I was forced to burn the passport without any witnessing and without actually documenting the burning. But I managed to steal 200 passports, and I still don't know what to do with them. 1 million Finnish passports in Helsinki. And I'm going to end with this project because I think they asked me to do this in 40 minutes. This is Skoghall in Sweden. This is the largest paper mill in the world. It's called Stora Enso. And they decided to move into this area of Skoghall where there was nothing and to create the largest paper mill in the world. So they had to bring 3,000 workers. And of course, they had to give them habitat. They have to give them a church and a school and a hospital, and the city was born around Stora Enso. And today it's an 80,000 people to 100,000 people that live here, and the entire economy revolves around the paper mill. This is the city hall, this is a church, and this is the main pedestrian street, this is the supermarket. So in my research, I quickly discovered that there were many artists living in Skoghall, but there was no space for art. There was no Konsthall. There was no space like a small museum, a community museum. And I realized that the entire infrastructure, civic infrastructure of the city had been built and financed by the paper mill. So I rejected the funding that had been offered to me by the city, and I requested a meeting with the board of directors of the paper mill. And I argued to them, listen, you have funded this city. It exists because of you. I think you should fund a small Konsthall for the city of Skoghall. They accepted. And so we designed and built the first Konsthall in Skoghall. These are views of the paper mill. This is some of their production facilities. This is how they export the paper. This is called Tetra Pak. It is used to make milk and juice cartons, and it goes all around the world. Here is the little museum made with paper, Tetra Pak paper from the paper mill and wood from the paper mill. It measures 8 meters deep, 20 meters long, and 6 meters tall. And the iconography I use is similar to the church that's behind. The ceiling is paper, the floor is paper. And for the opening, I invited 15 young Swedish artists from all over Sweden to create works related to paper. A young artist from Stockholm created this origami table offering children the possibility of making paper sculptures inside this paper museum, inside this paper town. Another did interviews over the phone and asked inhabitants of Skoghall, how is it possible that in 30 years history, you never thought about having a small museum in Skoghall? And most people answered, we're fine like this, we don't need one. So this is the opening. The entire community came. They really wanted to see what is a museum in Skoghall. We had music from the paper mill orchestra because, as I said, the paper mill controls absolutely the entire life of the city. And we had the mayor of the city, Leif Bergman, who did a very beautiful speech to open the Skoghall Konsthall. And this is the moment everyone is waiting for. And of course, like in every opening, you cannot see anything. This was probably the most successful work. Children took turns all day long during the opening, making these paper sculptures. This is a few hours later, that corner with all the sculptures everywhere. So exactly 24 hours after the opening, we took down the Swedish flag and we did this. The burning was pre-planned. Everybody knew I was going to burn it in 24 hours. The logic of the project was that I wanted to offer the community a glimpse of what contemporary art is. And once they had it, to take it away. Because I was not going to impose an institution to a community that failed or seemed not to want one. I just wanted to show what it was. And I had to do it in the most dramatic way to represent metaphorically the absence of culture, the absence of the museum. So there were protests at the beginning. They said, listen, Mr. Jaar, we understand now what you're trying to do. Let's save it. We love it. We want to keep it. But of course, it was built to be destroyed. It would not stand the next rain or the next snow. But that's exactly the reaction I wanted to provoke, to trigger that they feel the need for it. And so what happened is that a year after the project and the burning of the Konsthall, each city in Sweden was invited to select the most important architecture of the city. And Skoghall selected the Konsthall as the most important building. And 7 years later, I was called back as an architect to design the permanent Konsthall for Skoghall. And we're still working on it. We're still trying to find the last part of the funding we need to do it. So the Skoghall Konsthall in Skoghall, Sweden. I have exactly 2 minutes left, and I'm going to rush with this project that I did in Dallas, in Texas, at the Neue Museum. As you know, the Neue is one of the top museums in this country. It was designed by Renzo Piano, and it's dedicated to sculpture. It's a very beautiful museum. They have extraordinary Giacometti sculptures, probably the best in this country. I was invited by the museum to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the institution. And in my research, I quickly discovered that it's an extraordinary institution with extraordinary programs, with extraordinary works, extraordinary artists, extraordinary collection, and this fantastic park in the back of the museum with extraordinary 20th century sculpture. But I also realized that the audience was quite limited. It was a very white, very wealthy audience that lives around the museum, which is in downtown Dallas. And so the entire African American population, the Latino population, the Asian American population was being kind of ignored. There was no program that would attract them. And so I suggested to the director of the museum that I wanted to do a project not to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the museum, but perhaps to celebrate the anniversary of those that should come to the museum that have never been to the museum. And the project was accepted. So these are views of the park outside, in the back of the museum. And this is the location of the museum in the Dallas map. As you can see, it's practically in the center of the city. And that's the richest part of the city, the most expensive part. And so I identified for this project the hospitals in the city that were giving birth to new citizens of Dallas. And of those, I selected 3 hospitals. The African American Hospital, the Hospital of the Latinos, and the hospital known as the Hospital of the Illegals. And I decided to work with these 3 hospitals to try to make a connection with the museum. So all these 3 hospitals have maternity wards. And I wanted to work with the newborn babies of Dallas, but newborn babies of those communities that have no access and have never been into that museum. So we had volunteers witnessing the birth of new citizens of Dallas in those 3 hospitals. And we recorded the first cries of those babies. And so these are the views of one of the rooms where this is happening. And we built a pavilion in the garden of the Neue. It's a cube that measures 7 by 7 by 7, 21 by 21 by 21 feet. And it's done with wood and plexiglass with 15 shades of green. and it's sitting on top of the pool. So you are invited to go through this little bridge to go inside. And inside, nothing is happening. It's very simple with these chairs. And depending on the position of the sun, you have this kind of light, or this kind of light, or this kind of light. So it's a space to inviting people to come and meditate and to think about life and culture. The ceiling is transparent with 3 accents of those greens. And in the ceiling, we hid 4 speakers that are connected to these hospitals. And every time a baby is born in these 3 hospitals, we can hear their first cries here in this room. And so we recorded these cries, and we did a master tape with the cries that would repeat every day at the same time. So if the baby was born at 5 p.m., 6 minutes and 10 seconds, every day at that time, you would hear that particular cry. And so we accumulated these cries. So after a few weeks, we had dozens, hundreds of cries, and sometimes moments of silence. So people came and waited for these cries to happen and to celebrate these lives of these citizens that have never been into this museum. So to the families that participated in the program, we gave them a 1-year membership, free membership to the museum. So after their baby was born, after a few weeks, they started coming with the baby to the museum to hear the baby born again and share with their families that magic moment that we recorded. And so slowly the audience started to change because we brought these audiences to the museum. And to the babies that participated, we gave them something that did not exist, that we created for this project, which was a lifetime membership. So that means that these babies, when they will be 15, 20, 25 and on, they will still be members of this museum. And hopefully they will affect the program and change the program. So my project really tried to change the demographic of this institution by inviting these communities that were not represented in the museum. And this is the way we did it. A few last images. So we had the time to remind people at the time of their birth. And this couple, for example, she's from Iran, and she came when she was pregnant, and she accepted to participate. So she wanted to see the space where she could hear the sound of the birth of their son every day after that. So this project is called Music. Everything I know, I learned the day my son was born. So I will stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alfredo, for this really inspiring talk and a kind of selective tour of some of your practice, which has been so rich and productive for so many of us. I have a couple of questions to get us started, and then I know that some people who are watching also have questions for you. The Nasher project, I think, leads me to my first query to you, which has to do with how you think about audiences, both inside and outside the conventional art museum spectatorship. So I'm thinking, I mean, it seems like you're really interested in cultivating lots of different kinds of viewers for your work. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about, for example, going back even to studies on happiness, how that you conducted this survey on the street, a kind of, to passersby who just happened to come to intersect with you, and if there was a difference, or if you felt there was a difference when you set up the video interviews inside the space of the museum. That at Beaux Arts, is that the museum where that was happening?
Yes.
Right. So yeah, I'd love to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about how it seems like you're working maybe in several different registers at once, which is to say, importantly, often at the behest of the art institution, at the invitation of the art institution, often that's where the residue and the documents exist, but you're also trying to engage importantly with different kinds of publics, extra institutional publics.
Yeah, thank you. As I explained, I'm an architect making art, and the methodology of the architect consists in responding to the context. And I give myself a program. And the program always includes the audience. So it's an intrinsic part of the program. I cannot have a program with an objective without an audience, because you need to know who you're talking to and what are your objectives with regards to this audience. So yes, I'm always thinking obsessively about the audience, and I'm always trying to include in the program what I call points of entry, so every audience can enter the work. Because, you know, I'm interested in communicating with the audiences. And if you look at the definition of communication, the technical definition, it's not throwing out a message out there. That's not communication. Communication requires an answer. If there is no answer, there is no communication. So it's very important that you understand your audience and you are able to create channels of communication, feedback from them. Without that, there is no communication. And in my view, there is no art. So that's why my obsessiveness with incorporating the audience into my program and designing the work for many different audiences, so I can actually have a dialogue with an audience as large as possible. Mm-hmm. In the case of studies on happiness, of course, I was just leaving things to chance. I didn't know who was going to approach me. I went to different barrios of the city, and so I was expecting different social classes, which I did get. I didn't know which ones will be more responsive, but I think they were responsive in the same way. And in the case of the Dallas project, of course, by targeting these specific hospitals, I knew who would be the participants of the project, and I knew, and this is the people I wanted to bring into the museum. And you know, it was for me important, because when you bring these voices into the museum, these are babies that are just born, and the first thing they do, they perform inside the museum. So we convert them symbolically into artists, as performers. They're not coming in as visitors, they're coming as performers. So all these symbolic things are happening in my dialogue with the audiences.
Well, that brings me to my next question. The idea of the baby's cry, you're reframing that as art in the space of the pavilion that you built. I was thinking, as I was watching you with this through line that you generated for us of these various projects, certain things were connecting for me in kind of a new way of thinking about what you do. I was thinking about how you've developed a kind of resistant language, or a kind of language of dissidence, but of course so structured through your experiences during the dictatorship that so many of them actually are about silence or a sonic experience. A lot of them are actually resist go into the realm of the abstract or the non-visual. So I was thinking, or refusal. So I was thinking about the squawking of the clarinet, or the scream of the baby, or even the red of the pavilion, or the white circles. You know, so much that is about ellipsis or projection, or, you know, ways in which your aesthetic language leaves quite a lot of room. You know, it isn't, I mean, some of it is quite, is about centering facts. You know, a lot of what you do has to do with documents and data information, but there is also this level of the gap, I guess. And I guess I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about, you know, the blankness of the circle or the open-endedness of the squawk.
Yeah, I think that I may have two answers for that. First of all, as a communicator, I believe in the power of a single idea. So when I work on a project, I'm always editing. And I edit again and again and again. Because what we failed as artists always is that we are trying to communicate 37 things at the same time. And it just doesn't work. I don't know you, you don't know me, we speak different languages. How can I communicate 37 things in a single work of art? You can't. So I tried to edit it down and to reduce it clearly to a single idea. That would be one answer. The other answer, of course, is about poetry, is about speaking in between the lines, because that's how I grew up as an artist. My first work as an artist were about to say without saying, because we were afraid. So we had to invent this kind of cryptic language, poetic language that the dictatorship was not able to read, but still communicate with it. So that was the challenge. And so this idea of speaking in between the line to suggest without banging you on the head with something, it's coming from there. And of course, the third reason would be that I'm an architect, so I'm interested in sharpness, in cleanness. I'm not Baroque in that sense. I'm very much focusing on this idea and what is the best way for me to communicate that idea.
So I'm going to thank you for that. That's very thoughtful. I'm going to transition now to some of the questions that are coming in from the people watching. This first question is from Tausif Noor, who's one of the amazing grad students in my seminar. And he asks, you described the paper mill work as successful, partially by virtue of children's participation. How do you negotiate what is successful across your public interventions, which are very different?
Right. Thank you. A very good question. Well, it's part of my program. So in the program, the artist defines what is success. For some artists, they want to sell the work or they want to get a review. Other artists give themselves a program and they say, okay, how do I define what is my objective and what would be success for this work? In the case of Skoghall, of course, I wanted to trigger this reaction that I received, which was, okay, let's build one now that you showed us what it is. So in that sense, it was successful. Of course, I was happy that the kids participated and so on. But the ultimate objective was for the entire community to decide, we want a Konsthall in Skoghall, in our town. So that was my objective. And it's one of the few projects where I've achieved my objective, but not yet, because we are still looking for the final funding to actually do it. But when we finally build this permanent Konsthall and we do the opening, this is when the project will have closed the circle and the project will be completed. So it's really about you as an artist. You have the privilege to define your program and to define what does success mean. But most projects, you have an objective, but they always fail. In the case of the homeless in Montreal, of course, I wanted to create a polemics and I wanted people to think about them. And we gave them visibility. Some of them became quite well known thanks to the press that went to interview them, to ask them for opinion. And they were visible. They became human beings suddenly in the eyes of the media and of the people. But then I was not able to get them homes. So in that sense, I failed. But at least we gave them visibility, and the issue of homelessness was raised by this project in a way that respected their privacy and they respected their dignity without actually displaying their faces. So in each project, you have to calibrate and decide, what are you going to settle with? Sometimes it's a very ambitious objective, and sometimes it's a smaller kind of objective.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how the face, which was so important in the project where you excerpted and focused in on the face from those archival photos, which is the entire piece, really is lavishing that attention on the specificity, and then the stepping away from that and deciding that the face is really should not be the focus of attention in the Montreal piece. So I have a question here from Alejandro Munera, another wonderful student and graduate student at Berkeley. How do you manage to navigate so well the institutional limits and the geographical borders that you cross between? What are some of the challenges of conceptual art with the people who inhabit precisely those borders?
Well, I think that it's very important that you communicate with the audiences and the institutions in the most open, honest way. And so So I never start with a project. I start with an introduction of the kind of things I do. I present my work. I show them explain my methodology. I explain the kind of time limits I need to work, the kind of resources I need. And so I set up the entire system in the most clear way possible. And then I sign a contract where I'm totally free. So once the contract is signed, they cannot stop me. But I will not impose anything on the institutions or on the audiences. The work will be the result of the research done in situ and of the essence of what the place, requires, hopefully, if I get to that definition. And so it's really about dialogue. It's really about dialogue. And of course, in my case, it's the privilege of receiving all these invitations and getting all this funding from this institution and let me do what I'm thinking about. So if I didn't have the collaboration of the institutions and of the public at large that participate, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. Mm-hmm. And this also, if I may say something about that, is that you realize that institutions are not monolithic. Mm-hmm. Institutions are made of people, of individuals like me and you. And you can talk to people, you can have conversations, you can have dialogues, and you can be transparent. And through this dialogue, you reach a base where you can feel confident that they would accept what you want to do and they will actually help you, even if it goes against their way of thinking or their ideological framework. It doesn't matter. Once there is this communication, it can happen.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of questions about how introductions are made or how you find the communities that you work within, et cetera, but which I feel like you're answering. I have a question also from my colleague, Professor Natalia Brizuela, who asks, I would like to hear you talk about the way in which you have become a commentator on the many injustices that plague our world. What is gained and what is lost in this global mobility?
Well, almost everything is lost, unfortunately. I mean, we are bombarded by millions of ideas of things without mercy, without warnings, and everything is drowning in a sea of consumption around us. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult. And that's why perhaps that I divided my practice in three main areas. Only a third of me does stuff in the art world, another third does these public interventions because I want to reach another audience, and then another third teaches and works with students in different institutions around the world, and where I share my experience with them and from which I learn enormously. So I feel that I'm complete as a human being, as a professional, only by doing these three things at the same time. And that helps me to reach a larger audience too. And that gives me, a little more outreach than being just a regular artist in our little art world system. But it is also true that what we can do is limited. It is totally limited. And it's very difficult to reach a point where you can say you have succeeded in making a change. But I think it's important to do it. It's important to insist, to create these little cracks in the system. They are very important, that people know that they're not alone. Because we, in a way, we create models of thinking the world. So even if these models are just prototypes, eventually culture at large will pick them up and then will repeat them. So I think it's important to do it. Besides, as I suggested in my presentation, the spaces of art and the spaces of culture are definitely today the last remaining spaces of freedom. There is no other place where we can do what we do. And so we have to take care of them, and we have to keep working.
I have a question from Rachel Winter, who's a grad student at UC Santa Barbara, but she's joining our seminar remotely, one of the upsides of the Zoom culture, which is, she says that many monographs describe you as a Palestinian Chilean artist, and she's curious how the Palestinian facet of your identity plays into your work, if at all. And I know personally that, you know, I think our mutual friend, Emily Jasser, is potentially doing a whole project about the quite large Palestinian community in Chile.
Right. Well, I was born in Chile, and my father was born in Chile, and my grandfather too. So I'm like fourth generation. So I had this in the background, but also I was born in Chile, and then I moved to Martinique. So I had a French education, and then I moved to Chile back again, and I moved to New York. So I have these many layered identities, and that's been very difficult to work with them. So what I've decided to do is to be a citizen of the world. And of course, all these things are in the background and inform my way of thinking and looking at the world. But every work, it responds to the context in which I'm working.
I have a question from Annika Linson, who's my co-teacher for this graduate seminar. Hi, Annika, who writes, I was intrigued by the screen tests for happiness in the Studies on Happiness project. They seem somewhat corporate, like a focus group, and yet also Brechtian as a way to draw spectators into participation. She'd love to hear more about this aspect of the project vis-a-vis your thinking around 1978. That is to say, the kind of Brechtian aspect about participation, and also about what other range of participation or data collection those video testimonies sparked.
A few people read text that they had prepared. A couple of people, they came and they turned their back to the camera and read text, but you could not see their faces. A lot of people spoke off camera, so you could hear their voice, but you couldn't see them. Some people were real actors. They acted plays. They kissed, they talk, they drink, they laugh, they told jokes. So it was a full range of expressions, and I was not designing any of them. I mean, I had no idea if one person was willing to participate in this play. And I was surprised that so many did. Because again, we are a moment where fear is the one that moves you or doesn't move you. So I had no idea what would happen. But even if not a single person had come up and sat there in front of the camera, just the fact that this little work in our little art world in Chile was offering this space where you could actually say something publicly was, for me, important. That was the value, just that. Now that people participate, even better, but just the fact that we're offering that space was enough for me. But as I said, I could not design any of this participation, but I was very lucky so many people did.
I have a question here from Donna, who writes, there seems to be an interesting entanglement between the repetition of nightmare and the formal qualities of nightmare itself as repetition. Where does this embodied experience of drawing the number 11 fit into the psychic and aesthetic experiences of repetition?
Wow. Well, for me, repetition is not repetition. Every time you repeat something, it becomes something else. And I found this fascinating. Now, I can say that retrospectively. Because of course, at the time, I was just obsessed with that day that changed my life. You know, in my generation, we could not party. More than three people could not reunite. For years, there was a curfew. We had to be home at 8 p.m. And it was forbidden to meet more than two people at once, because more than three people was considered like a political meeting, and you could be arrested. So my generation went through something extraordinary that for us, it was a nightmare, as she said. And so at the time, I wasn't aware of actually exactly what I was doing by this this was my simple, graphic way, poetic way to talk about my nightmare without saying nightmare. I was just saying 11, 11, 11. And so this is the way it happened. And when September 11 happened here in New York, I was actually here in this studio, actually. I couldn't believe that it happened on the same day. And from that moment on, our September 11, the Chilean one, disappeared. It became El Once Chico, the small 11. Mm-hmm. Because when it happened at the time, it was in a small country in Chile. There was no internet. The media world was not what it is today. So it didn't have the same visibility that September 11 in New York had. And that one just made the other 11 disappear.
I know, I love that question because you did describe those early works, which now you're folding into this origin story for yourself. You call them gestures, not artworks, you know, so, but I think we do see intimations of a lot of the things that will recur.
Right.
Including a very precise sense of the formal qualities of how even your nightmares are spinning themselves out in very controlled letters said. And, you know, it's a fascinating sense of the tension there, I guess, between, you know, the uncontrolled and what you can fit into the neat little squares of the calendar. I have a question, and maybe this will be our final question from Michele Dorizio. It seems that your practice expands the notion of site specificity beyond the mere topographical qualities of your site of intervention. Is site specificity a phrase that belongs to you?
Well, maybe. I'm interested in site specificity, but the language I've always used is about context. Mm-hmm. And I think that context is bigger than site specificity. I think, in my view, as an architect who makes art, site specificity is not enough. Because site specificity could be just the actual physical site. That could be site specific. When for me, that's not enough. I need to know what's happening around it. I need to know the larger context. So for me, I always said that I respond to the context and not to the site specificity of a place. I think context is bigger, is larger, is deeper. There are many layers. So I prefer context.
I think in some ways the Montreal project is it feels like one of the things you're explicitly thematizing there is in a way the failure of the artist to truly grasp the context that they're coming into, you know, the idea that you went 7 times, you know, maybe for an architect building a building that seems really lavish, like a lot of attention, but there was something right under your nose there that you didn't notice until at the very, very end. And right. The sense that, you know, the visiting artist, I mean, how much context can they ever really grasp? There will always be a partiality. There will always be some, you know, slippage there. I think it's impressive to me that you decided to build your project kind of around that failure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you once again, Alfredo. This was a long time in the making, and I know that my students really appreciate it and everyone else watching, and I hope you stay safe in New York during the pandemic and all of this turmoil that we lived through. And I want to thank everyone at the Arts Research Center, Lauren Pearson, Laurie McPhee, of course, and everyone at ETS at UC Berkeley for making this go so smoothly. And once again, my heartfelt thanks also to Annika Linson for teaching this seminar with me, and to Alfredo Jaar for being with us this evening.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.